So two new developments surrounding Highguard that I want to talk about. The first one is that its website has just randomly gone down, which has caused a lot of speculation as to what fate holds for this game. And then the other one is that Highguard was funded by none other than Tencent. And this information that wasn't disclosed, it was something that was leaked by a journalist whose sources told them so, and what the implications of all of that are. So Highguard, for those who don't know, is the live service raid shooter PvP game that was announced at the Game Awards 2025 as the big finale, which was a big mistake because it raised expectations sky high for the title. And also, looking at the trailer, many felt like it wasn't worthy of that big finale slot. It went very silent for a while, and then the game finally launched on January of 2025. And since then, we have seen mixed reception from both critics as well as users alike, as you can see yourself. And then the player numbers, while it started strong due to the curiosity and attention surrounding it, with almost 100,000 players at the peak of its Steam lifespan, you can see right here that those numbers have significantly dipped since, and they continue to dip with 24-hour peaks now in the low 1,000. So yeah, fate does not look good for this title, on top of the fact that we learned recently that most developers at Wildlight, which is the development studio for Highguard, have been laid off, as confirmed by Wildlight itself in a statement confirming that layoffs did in fact happen, but they insist that they're keeping a core group of developers to continue innovating on and supporting the game. Though how long that will actually last, well, that's the question, isn't it? Though not a lot of people are particularly optimistic about the game's future. Jeff Keighley himself highlighted how this is a sad outcome for a game I enjoyed in early playtests. I think Jeff Keighley made a genuine attempt to just try to support this game, and I think he genuinely enjoyed the game. But I think his plan to feature this game as the big finale was a huge mistake. The game was originally supposed to shadow drop. Jeff Keighley wanted to announce it at the Game Awards, but I think that ultimately ended up bringing a lot of negative PR to the game prior to its launch. And while I don't know if it's the sole cause of the game's downfall, I don't think it ultimately helped either. I think ultimately Highguard didn't stand out enough from the rest of the other live services out there in this oversaturated market for it to be able to retain the players that did, show up at launch, almost 100,000 players, but, a lot of them just left very quickly. Optics surrounding Highguard's future looked even worse when this development happened, where if you go to Highguard's website right now, you'll find this notice saying that the site is unavailable. And that is just something that you don't normally see happen. The fact that most employees at Wildlight were laid off was already an indication of things to come. That was already kind of the writing on the wall, suggesting that Highguard might be winding down. And then this website situation, the website suddenly being unavailable, made that speculation even more rampant. Journalists tried to reach out to Wildlight, but apparently PR declined to comment, which didn't help optics. It's also worth noting that Highguard's social media has gone radio silent since February 12, 2026, when they issued their most recent update, patch notes that highlight some improvements that they made to the game. Now, apparently a Highguard developer did respond to somebody inquiring why the website was down on Discord, and this is what they had to say. Whether it can be believed or not remains to be seen. In response to somebody saying, "What's up with the website being updated?" this developer said, "Not sure on the time frame, but basically needs to be transferred and simplified," whatever that means. "Low priority at the moment, reputational damage already done. Now we just need to focus on delivering updates and content to improve." So the insinuation by this developer is that they're going to continue working on the game, they're going to continue improving it, they're going to continue adding content to it, though I don't know how that's possible with the current state of Wildlight, with most of its developers seemingly having been laid off. The way now former developer of Highguard framed upcoming content was, quote, "This one really stings as there was a lot of unreleased content I was really looking forward to that I and others designed for Highguard," almost as if to suggest that they were developing new content for Highguard that has since kind of been scrapped because of the fact that most developers were laid off, almost as if suggesting that that's content we will never see because content updates for the game will start to wind down. But this developer insists that whatever core team is left is still focusing on delivering updates and content to improve. I suppose only time will tell which ends up being the truth. But I just can't imagine that Wildlight can output updates and content at the level that they could when, they had a full team when they didn't lay off most of their developers. Regardless of whether new content is being worked on or not, it is at the very least clear that Highguard as a live service is in a lot of danger of shutting down right now. It's just not bringing in enough players, and that means that they're not getting enough money from its microtransactions store due to the low volume of players to maintain a free-to-play live service. It always struck me as kind of weird when Highguard developers like Highguard boss Chad Grenier came out with statements like how it doesn't really matter if there's tons of players playing the game, saying whether it gets 1,000 people or 100 million people, it doesn't matter. What matters most is that the game is loved by the people who played it. And then lead designer Mohamed Alavi coming out with this statement: honestly, we don't need player counts to be super huge in order to be successful. What we're really hoping for is a core group of fans that love us, that will allow us to grow. It's a free-to-play live service. Just logistically, you need a high volume of players who are highly engaged and spending a lot of money on those microtransactions in order to, from a business standpoint, make this game viable. So, these statements were just outright false. Objectively, you need high player counts for a free-to-play game to be successful. I know part of what they mean is that as long as we have enough players to sustain the game and people love it, that'll make us happy. But from a business standpoint, what you need is a sustained player base, and that's an area where Highguard is just not succeeding at right now. Now, another area where Highguard has made a lot of headlines is in the investors involved with funding this project. That was information that previously went undisclosed and people didn't know why. And now Stephen Totillo from GameFile, after doing some digging, discovered that Tencent secretly funded the now struggling shooter Highguard. Wildlight Entertainment has said for years it was fully funded, but never shared exact details. And indeed, if you go to their LinkedIn right now, you'll find that in the overview section, the description reads, Wildlight Entertainment is a new, fully funded entertainment studio. Now, it does not say right here that it is self-funded, so they didn't outright lie, but the omission of information, the fact that they didn't disclose that Tencent was one of the big funders of this game, it's just something that strikes a weird note. People are wondering, why does this have to be a secret? Why do they keep that information under wraps? And the thing with Tencent is that it didn't just contribute a small amount of money. Apparently, the majority of Highguard's funding came from China's gaming powerhouse Tencent. More specifically, Tencent's Timmy Studio Group was responsible for backing Highguard's development. The reason for the secrecy regarding the arrangement is unclear, and it's not known exactly how much Timmy contributed to the project, though Totillo's sources indicate it was a significant amount of funding. But yeah, apparently in past interviews, they were straight up asked about who was funding the game, but the studio declined to comment on who was investing in the studio. And of course, journalists have been reaching out to Wildlight to inquire about Tencent's involvement and why that was kept under wraps. But so far, outlets like Insider Gaming, who reached out for comment, have not received a response. Now look, an up-and-coming new studio seeking investment is not necessarily a bad thing, nor is it a practice that is outside of the norm. But the reason this is gaining headlines for Highguard specifically is the way Highguard was marketed as this indie game. It was consistently touted to be as, a game coming from the little guys, but when you get a significant investment from a company like Tencent, such claims are more called into question. And trust, Wildlight and Highguard wouldn't be the only development studio and game that had Tencent involved as an investor. Scrolling down through this article, for example, you find plenty of not only just major companies, but also, like Larian Studios, which is self-published. The creators of Baldur's Gate 3, 30% of them are owned by Tencent. Beloved studios like FromSoft have Tencent involved, so on and so forth. And scrolling further down, Remedy, 14% of that company belongs to Tencent. Tencent has been an investor in tons and tons of development studios and companies. But the narrative that was consistently presented with Highguard is that this is coming from the small guys. Wildlight and Highguard tried to present themselves as being in a more humble position than they truly were. Because when you put the indie label of something, people give a little more leeway to that indie project, knowing the struggles that come with such an endeavor, especially if you're fully self-funded. But with Highguard, with the backing of a company like Tencent, they had a lot of support. And just to highlight what I mean by the way this game was presented as that humble indie development environment, here's what Jeff Keighley said during the Game Awards.
The power of independent, self-published studios to push this medium forward is a growing and I think positive theme in our industry.
So that's how Highguard was framed, this indie studio essentially, which, I mean, technically they are in the sense that they are technically self-published. And the thing is, the term indie doesn't really have like a set definition. It's almost like a spectrum, and indie means different things to different people. Technically, Larian and CD Projekt are independent in the sense that they are self-published, but they are making, high-level AAA games and are getting funding from companies like Tencent. Again, with Larian, Tencent owns 30% of that company. So in that scenario, would you say Larian is indie? You know what I mean? Like, those are the questions that you ask when it comes to that terminology. For others, indie is defined by a game made under very humble environments, a small team, self-funded, with no outside investors, no backing from external forces or major corporations, purely made in-house by just a few passionate people, by a few underdogs who are trying to compete alongside all of these big AAA games and all the other games out there in this hyper-competitive market. With Highguard, it is a game made by Wildlight Studios and also published by Wildlight Studios. It is self-published, but the lack of disclosure of just how much money Tencent contributed, as well as it consistently touting itself as like a humble indie studio, that's where there's some kind of narrative dissonance, and that's where people are kind of expressing their suspicions on the way this game was touted and the way Wildlight presented itself. There was that one developer, I talked about this in a previous video titled Highguard Dev Publicly Blames Gamers and Creators for Game's Failure, discussing a statement from a former tech artist and rigger at Wildlight who came out being displeased about the way people covered the game before it came out. And yeah, in many ways blamed gamer culture and content creators for the game's downfall when, again, 100,000 people showed up to play the game and then they voluntarily left, this being a free-to-play game too. Like, that to me is more of an indicator than like what people were saying about the game prior to launch. And also Jeff Keighley elevating it to, big finale status at the Game Awards only raised the expectations surrounding the game further. Like, none of that was the decision of gamers or content creators. People were just expressing their honest opinions based on the circumstances and the trailers and the game that was presented. But in this statement, this developer talks about how even if Highguard had a rocky launch, our independent, self-published, dev-led studio full of passionate people just trying to make a fun game with zero AI and zero corporate oversight deserved better than this. Again, just emphasizing the humble nature of their circumstances. And sure, their circumstances are more humble than your typical big AAA situation, but being backed by Tencent is also not the humblest situation you can be in. Now, it's worth noting that this developer has since deleted their account because, yeah, that statement just didn't go down well, and no doubt he was facing a lot of backlash that he didn't want to deal with. And I don't think he was speaking for all of the developers who worked at Highguard, but that statement, I think, ultimately did more PR damage, and it just didn't help the situation at all. Now, the statement that takes this whole situation from keeping Tencent a secret to outright lying is this one right here from Dusty Welch, CEO and co-founder of Wildlight Entertainment. When interviewed by thegamebusiness.com, this is a statement that was provided that comes across as an outright lie after recent news and developments surrounding Tencent's involvement being leaked. He straight up said, "We're an independent studio without the support of a big organization." And then in a follow-up that almost makes it sound like the game was self-funded, he said, "Our money goes right into the development of the game." We now know that Tencent was one of the major investors in this game. How can you construe that as an independent studio without the support of a big organization? Organizations don't come any bigger than Tencent in the realm of gaming. With the other statements, you could have said, well, that was a lie by omission. They just didn't say that Tencent was involved. But in this scenario, with this statement right here, it's just an outright lie that Wildlight didn't have the support of a big organization. It did. Its name is Tencent. And so that's when the usage of the indie label, when not all of the context is provided, starts to become almost like an exploitative way to use that terminology. I think Legendary Drops here puts it best. Devs, we try to do it the indie way. It's kind of how that one developer who spoke out blaming gamers and content creators framed it. From there, Legendary Drops' take is that I don't have an issue with Tencent necessarily because Larian, Digital Extremes, GGG, the developers of Path of Exile, all do the same and they do fine. But this was a shameless investor-backed live service game wearing the skin of past games. And then this is the bit that I think I agree with, and trying to ride the indie hype without proper disclosures and at times full on saying that they are not backed by a big organization. As Ethan Gash also puts it here, of course it's not surprising that Wildlight raised money through multiple rounds of investment. It's not surprising that they needed investors for what they were trying to do. The unusual thing is that unlike many other studio startups in the last 5 years, it never publicized the initial investment or subsequent funding cycles. Like, that secrecy is outside of the norm, and we still don't know why that was necessary to keep that a secret. Straight up, Paul Tassi from Forbes, who covers a lot of live services, just pondered, why did this need to be a secret? This wouldn't be making headlines if they had just disclosed that from the outset prior to the game's launch, but now people are looking at this lack of disclosure with just suspicion, and understandably so, especially after past statements. And so the perception out there right now is ones like these. If there's one thing I hate more than corporate AAA, it's studios with corporate backing and culture pretending to be scrappy indie devs pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. Yeah, you can't classify Wildlight as one such scenario when they got such a significant backing from one of the biggest organizations in the world. Again, nothing wrong with independent developers seeking funding. Something like Clair Obscure Expedition 33, at one point it partnered with publisher Kepler Interactive and was published by this entity. Now, at this point, I would say that you can't really call Expedition 33 an indie game. It's more of like a AA game that got funding from Kepler, but that's fine. It's still an impressive story. It's still about this dude who quit Ubisoft and gathered this team together, and they made something really special as their first game as a team. Like, Sandfall Interactive is still like a brand new studio and made an impressive mark for their very first launch, so that's still worth celebrating, and they did so with a relatively smaller budget. I think it was like something like less than $10 million to make this game, so all of that is really impressive. It is an underdog story. All of this did come together under scrappy circumstances, but it has to be acknowledged that, yeah, they got a lot of support from a publisher like Kepler. The thing with Sandfall Interactive and Expedition 33 is that it didn't try to keep Kepler Interactive's involvement a secret, nor did it ever claim that it was this incredibly humble indie development studio with no support, or, like, they didn't misconstrue their circumstances. Wildlight and Highguard kind of did, and so on top of all the other negative press that they're receiving, this is just adding on top of that. And it's not going to serve the game's longevity very well. Like, already it's on thin ice, and this is only going to further diminish its chances of making a comeback, which I don't think it has much of a chance of doing. But this situation is just not going to help that. Now, some people are pointing out the fact that among the members of the advisory board for the Game Awards is none other than Stephen Ma, SVP at Tencent. On top of the fact that if you look up Tencent and Jeff Keighley, how they've maintained a long-standing strategic partnership primarily focused on expanding the global reach of the Game Awards and other gaming events. This is what Google's AI says, at least, and using both of these facts as like a smoking gun to be like, Jeff Keighley was under obligation to promote this game. He didn't actually like it. This was all just like, money being exchanged behind the scenes and stuff like that. I don't know if I'd go quite that far, because on the advisory board, there are tons of people from tons of other companies. Like, Kojima is on the board, and at last year's Game Award, he didn't win any awards and stuff like that. So I genuinely think that Jeff Keighley just really liked Highguard personally and really thought everyone else would think the same, and just made the mistake of featuring Highguard as the big finale of the Game Awards 2025 without knowing what the consequences would be. As for this strategic partnership, that only has to do with streaming the Game Awards in China, just so that people in China can also check out the show, and having the show be translated live for Chinese audiences. That's really what that partnership is about. It doesn't, from what I understand, stretch beyond that. Now, if there's more information that comes to light about this, then I'll report on it, but I don't want to make conjectures on matters that don't have all of the evidence backing the claims. Frankly, I don't even know if Jeff Keighley knew when he announced Highguard at the Game Awards that the game was backed by Tencent. But regardless of that side of things, the fact remains that things are not looking good for Highguard. Its player base has not improved at all in recent days and weeks. All of this just casts an even bigger shadow on a game that already had a mountain to overcome. If it had any hopes of making a comeback, those chances are diminishing ever more with especially this latest round of negative press. But yeah, for those wondering what this latest development is all about, who've been hearing rumblings, I hope this gives you a good summary of everything and gives you a good idea of the current state of Highguard. I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on all of this. Do you believe the developers when they say that the website was shut down, just like seemingly for maintenance purposes, and it has nothing to do with the state of the game? Or do you think it indicates that, Highguard is very much winding down? And also, what's your take on Tencent's backing, the lack of disclosure there? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.